Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining Monarch Center for Autism today for our webinar entitled Managing Challenging Behaviors Exhibited by Individuals with Autism. I hope you were able to connect to us smoothly this morning. Please note, audio for this webinar is available either through your computer speakers or via conference call. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type chat them to either myself, that's Lauren Domenico, or to Dana Munn, who is listed as your host. You'll find the chat button in the top right-hand corner of your screen and the chat bar in the middle of the right-hand column of your screen. At the end of the webinar, our presenter, Stacy Cianciolo, will address all questions. But certainly, if you have technical questions as we progress, feel free to chat them to me, Lauren Domenico. So without further ado, I am very pleased to hand it over to Stacy, who is the Behavior Department Supervisor at Monarch School. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us. I'm so excited about this topic that we have before us today. Again, the title is Using an Interdisciplinary Approach to Managing Challenging Behaviors. I thought we'd start by just reviewing our objectives and what I hope everybody will take away from this presentation today. The first objective is to understand how setting events and antecedents can trigger challenging behaviors. We're going to talk a little bit about how they relate to each other and how compiled together behaviors can be, in fact, triggered to occur. We'll also discuss how to determine if a challenging behavior, when it occurs, is actually a teachable moment. There are times, I think, when challenging behaviors are present that we want to work through them. We want to use it as a learning opportunity, and we're going to look at some qualifiers to determine whether or not that would be appropriate for the challenging behavior that is present. We'll discuss how to maintain instructional control during meltdown moments. And we'll also talk about balancing de-escalation techniques with the applied behavior analysis techniques of extinction and reinforcement. We'll learn how to adapt an interdisciplinary approach to behavior to include speech and language pathology, occupational therapy, and more. And then, as Lauren Domenico mentioned, we'll have time at the end for questions and answers. Before we delve into our objectives and start to discuss each of these topics, I would like to begin with a story of a student. We'll talk about this story together, read this together, and then we will come back to this throughout the presentation to highlight the different objectives that we have. So hopefully this will illustrate all of the topics that we're discussing today. Our student, Matthew, is at a school during an afternoon group academic session. He has been presented with his visual schedule, and it includes an activity on the smartboard for math, teacher-led instruction, and independent math work. He is presented with a choice board and token board and selects outside to work for. He must earn 3 tokens during the 30-minute session and can earn a token for participating and completing his work and for staying in his seat. It has been raining on and off throughout the day, and outside has not been an option until this session. Matthew is feeling a little tired due to waking up very early that morning before school. He does not have the expressive language ability to share this, but his body language suggests it. He is slumped in his chair and continually putting his head down. He participates in the smartboard activity fully and receives his first token. During teacher-led instruction, it is very windy outside, and another student in the classroom begins scripting loudly. Additionally, music class is occurring next door. Matthew does not participate when the teacher asks him a question. He does not receive his token for that part of the schedule. He begins rocking in his seat and plugs his ears, vocalizing loudly. This behavior often precedes aggression. His parents report that he engages in this behavior again when he is anxious. When his independent work is presented to him, he pushes it on the floor. The assistant teacher prompts him to pick it up. He refuses, and she prompts again, this time guiding his arm down to pick it up. He resists, and she lets go, then removes another token. Matthew hits the teacher. We will keep Matthew's story in mind as we discuss each of these objectives. So let's begin with the first, antecedents and setting events. Antecedents, I believe, many of us are familiar with. Quite often, if you work with children with autism, you have been asked, I'm sure, to collect ABC data. This is antecedent behavior consequence data. Often when we are collecting this, we record the antecedents for the behaviors. We record whatever was happening in the environment immediately preceding the behaviors. Antecedents are those elements of the environment that may or may not cause the behavior, but that occurred just before the behavior did. These antecedents are things that we can observe in the environment, things that maybe somebody has said, a way that the environment has shifted or changed with sounds or lights or a demand. It could just be a situation where a student is engaging in a preferred activity. That may be their only antecedent, is that they are playing with a favorite toy or listening to music. The antecedents could be something similar to a teacher requiring a student to transition to a next class, or another friend saying, I don't want to play with you. Antecedents, again, are anything that we can observe in the environment immediately or at least recently preceding that behavior. Setting events, however, are quite often not observable. They are events or situations that may increase the likelihood of the behavior to happen at a later time. We all experience setting events in our own lives, of course, every day. If you are running late for work and woke up early, you might be a little bit anxious as you're driving and more likely to engage in road rage on the way to work. If you had an event in the morning where you spilled coffee and never got to drink it, then you might later on be craving coffee and want to go buy some. And that would be a setting event that would trigger you to stop to buy coffee once you happen to pass by a really short drive-through on the way. Setting events are difficult to record and they're difficult to acknowledge, but they absolutely impact our behavior, sometimes even more strongly than the immediate antecedent. They're very powerful when placed together. A setting event may occur previous in the day and cause that antecedent to be a powerful one, which then may trigger the behavior to occur. Oftentimes, we see an inconsistency in antecedents because of setting events, where we say sometimes this particular antecedent, such as presenting a demand, triggers aggression. Sometimes placing a demand on a student triggers escape behaviors, and sometimes it doesn't. And this is often when setting events are in play, and it's very important to assess the child's whole day to try to identify common setting events that, in collaboration with antecedents, can in fact trigger challenging behaviors. Let's take a look at how that's illustrated in Matthew's story. What was the antecedent for Matthew's behavior of pushing materials to the floor? When we look back in the story, we see that the immediate antecedent was that the independent work was presented to him. If we were simply analyzing the antecedents, that's what we would probably isolate, that when work is presented, sometimes he pushes it to the floor or refuses. Then we have the behavior of hitting his teacher. What was the antecedent for that? The immediate antecedent, recent one and immediate, was that the assistant teacher prompted him to pick up his work that fell to the floor. He refused. She prompts again, and this time she guides his arm down to pick it up. He resists, and she lets go and then removes another token. That entire situation occurred just before Matthew hit the teacher. We would include all of that information because it is a continuous chain of events. There isn't a lot interrupting those prompts, refusal, prompt again, removal of a token. Because they occur together as one behavior chain just before the aggression occurs, we would consider all of that the antecedent for that behavior. But are these the causes of Matthew's behavior? Did he hit his teacher because she prompted him? Is that the only cause? Did he refuse work simply because it was presented to him? Or were there any setting events or any other challenges in the environment or in Matthew's day that perhaps impounded or impacted the cause of this behavior? Let's keep looking. What were the setting events for Matthew's behaviors of pushing the materials to the floor? We know from the story that he was feeling a little tired due to waking up very early that morning before school. Could that perhaps have made it difficult for him to continue to participate? It could, but would that be the cause of his behavior? Just because he woke up early, does that mean he's going to be aggressive throughout the day? If he wakes up early or doesn't get a good night's sleep, is he always aggressive? It's not reliable to assume that being tired is the cause of his behavior. We know there must be more to it than that. Let's talk a little bit about teachable moments. How do we know if the moment in which we want to teach our students a new skill or review a current skill is actually a teachable moment? Is it time to learn? Is the student ready to learn? Ready behaviors look different for many students. There are students who can, in fact, acquire skills and achieve mastery on goals while vocalizing, while making lots of repetitive movements, while walking around or bouncing on a ball. There are students who actually learn better while doing gross motor activities. We know that some students are very kinesthetic learners, that if they can bounce or have a toy to fidget with, it actually improves their ability to participate. We know that other students are very distractible, and if they had a fidget toy or a ball to bounce on, in fact, it would reduce their ability to learn. So ready behaviors look different for different students. This is when it's very important to know our students well and to assume that not every student is the same in regards to how they best learn. But we can always look to whether or not he or she is attentive to the teaching materials. Are they making eye contact with the materials? Are they positioned physically towards the materials and looking as though they're engaged in this work? Are they exhibiting positive listening behaviors? Are there, even if they're vocalizing, are their vocalizations low enough or pausing enough to hear and comprehend what you're saying? Are they participating in instruction? Do you see some quick responses, both verbally and non-verbally, from your students when you ask them to participate? Those are definitely qualifiers to look for to determine if this is a teachable moment. And what do we do if it isn't? One advice I often give to teachers here at Monarch is to use behavior momentum. Start small, start easy. If you can ask the student to do something you know is simple for them and even enjoyable for them, and they participate, then it's easy to continue that momentum and move on to the more challenging work that you wish to present. What about Matthew? Was he ready to learn? Was this a teachable moment for him? Definitely in the beginning of the story, during that smartboard activity, he participated well. But what about the rest of that session? We know from our story that during independent work, during teacher-led instruction, he began rocking in his seat, plugging his ears, and vocalizing loudly. Based on how he presented during the smartboard activity while he was participating, these behaviors were not present. His ready-to-learn behaviors seem to be more along the lines of attentiveness and focus and calm. When he engages in rocking and vocalizing, we know that he is not attentive. He wasn't attentive to the teaching materials. He refused to respond to the teacher. He was not exhibiting those positive listening behaviors. He wasn't participating. So was he ready for the next demand? He wasn't able to participate in a verbal response or nonverbal response. So was he ready for independent work? Let's keep that in mind as we move along. Reinforcement and extinction. These are complicated, yet sometimes very simplified concepts from ABA. I think anybody who has some training in applied behavior analysis, and especially working with children with autism, is likely familiar with these two terms. But to define them clearly, reinforcement is a consequence following a behavior that increases the likelihood the behavior will happen again. This is one of my favorite definitions because it's actually so complicated. You don't know if something's reinforcing until you see the results. And I like that challenge. I like to find out the results to see, did we actually increase the likelihood of this behavior to happen again? Do we see, when we graph our results, that the rates of behavior are increasing? If they are, then we know that we have actually applied reinforcement to that behavior. We don't know if we're actually using reinforcement effectively until we see the progress, until we see those rates of behaviors increasing. So again, reinforcement is the consequence that increases the likelihood of the behavior to happen again. Extinction is the opposite. Extinction is when reinforcement has been occurring for behavior and then it stops and the behavior decreases. And when the reinforcement is no longer accessible, we would see the rates of that behavior declining. Sounds simple enough. However, we need to remember that extinction can be quite risky. It's not common for the reinforcement to be stopped and the progress of the behavior to simply reverse and start to slow down and then reduce all the way to non-existence or extinction. In fact, we often see what we call an extinction burst. We often see the behavior get worse before it gets better. It's human nature to not give up quickly. If there's something that has always been reinforcing to you and suddenly that reinforcement isn't available, quite often we just try harder. One of my favorite examples of that is a pop machine or any sort of vending machine. If you work somewhere that has a vending machine and it's your afternoon slump, 2:30, 3 o'clock, you like to go get a nice fresh soda, nice cold Coke, something along those lines, or a little snack, and you do this daily, and you take your dollar and you place it in the slot of the machine, and out comes the pop. Well, we have the setting event of feeling a little tired, a little hungry, of the reinforcement of the soda or the snack coming to you, and the behavior of putting the dollar in the slot. So the setting event would still occur, maybe even the antecedent of seeing 2 o'clock on the wall, which is the time that you have set for yourself to go get that little treat. And you engage in the same behavior you've engaged in day after day after day of putting the dollar in the pop machine. But then one day, the reinforcement doesn't come. The machine is broken, or the pop doesn't come out on the first try of pushing the button. Most of us, in my experience, and people that I've seen, or even I'm sure we've all seen this and been there, we don't simply say, oh, I guess this doesn't work anymore, and walk away. Typically, we try a little harder. We might push the button a few more times, push the button a little harder. Sometimes we might even shake the machine out of a little bit of frustration and say, come on, give me my dollar back, or give me my pop. Now, if we shake the machine, or even kick the machine, or engage in any other more intense behavior than a simple tap of the button, and that pop comes out, we'll be very likely to do that again the next time our pop doesn't come immediately. So while the machine has stopped giving the reinforcement, an extinction could occur. It's risky because if you can't sustain it, then you're actually reinforcing a more challenging behavior. And for children with autism especially, we know that changes in routines can increase anxiety and trigger behaviors. So when we apply extinction, we are changing those routines. We have an expectation, a student has an expectation of receiving reinforcement for a behavior that they engage in frequently. When that reinforcement is withheld, quite often we see anxiety increase, or a little bit of concern or worry about that routine, and behaviors will occur. Sometimes it's a more intensive behavior, more intensive presentation of the original behavior, and sometimes we find new behaviors emerge when this situation happens. I'm not suggesting that extinction shouldn't be used. I just want to always be clear on how risky it can be if it isn't used effectively. And to always ask yourselves, can I follow through with this extinction? Because if at some point you'll need to reinforce that behavior if it gets worse, so again, for aggression specifically, it's easy to ignore minor aggression. It's easy to ignore a scratch or a hit. But if you think the aggression could escalate to a point that you can't ignore, that you would no longer be safe, then extinction wouldn't be appropriate. The same holds true for property destruction. It's easy to ignore papers being torn or even a chair being tipped over. But at some point, you have to attend to the property destruction when students engage in throwing a computer or throwing a chair in the direction of a student. So if we think the behavior could grow in intensity, then extinction wouldn't be appropriate in and of itself. I want to take a step back in the slide and talk again about reinforcement. I mentioned that we don't know for sure if a consequence is reinforcing until we see the change in the behavior. We also don't want to assume that everything we like, everything a student likes, is reinforcing for that student. There's a big difference between preferences and reinforcement. A preference is something that a student would choose to do, something they seem to enjoy. They appear happy when engaging in that activity, or they appear pleased when you offer that item to them. However, there are items and activities that students prefer that aren't effective as reinforcement. Think about yourselves. There are many things you enjoy doing, but the ability to do them, would it be powerful enough for you to go to work for? So, for example, I love to read, but if somebody said they would no longer pay me to work, but instead would offer me time to read, I would likely not continue at that job. There's a very specific type of reinforcement I'm looking for in my work. There are other intrinsic reinforcements and reinforcers that I enjoy in my work, things that I like to do, that if they were removed, I would likely not feel reinforced for staying in that position. So it's important to remember for our students, if they don't enjoy the activity they're doing, if they don't have appropriate reinforcement, then you cannot expect them to participate fully in that activity. I often hear comments, or I have in the past heard comments of things along the lines of, well, he needs to do the work because it's his responsibility. He just needs to be able to do it, whether or not reinforcement is present. While I understand that is true for children as they grow up to learn to do activities they don't enjoy simply because they're told to do them, there's always some sort of underlying motivation for kids when they're asked to do things they don't like. For very many neurotypical children and children developing who are asked to do classroom work or even homework, they may engage in it to avoid an unpleasant stimulation, an unpleasant consequence. So they may finish their homework and finish their classwork so they don't lose recess. or they may finish their work because they want to have their teacher's approval. They want to please their teacher. Those are reinforcers just as well as items given. We don't always have to, like you could see me now, I'd be making air quotes here, bribe our students to do work with items and materials, but we do need to make sure that there's a reason for them to do it. If you are working with a child with autism who doesn't have that theory of mind of what I do, the work I complete, makes my teacher happy or my mom and dad happy, and I want them to be proud of me. If they don't have the intrinsic motivation of feeling good about completing their work and feeling proud of themselves, then we need to assume that external reinforcement is necessary. Again, everything we do as human beings has some sort of consequence, and everything we do is either maintained by reinforcement or not. So we need to keep that in mind. And again, reinforcement is different from play and leisure. Just because it's enjoyable and fun to do doesn't mean, again, that it's reinforcing. And we have to take a look at some elements of reinforcement that we're going to see, in the upcoming slide. Let's take a step back from Matthew's situation and look at what was the reinforcement for his positive behaviors. He was presented with a choice board and a token board, and he selected outside to work for. That was his intended reinforcement. I'm working under the assumption that his teachers know him well and that the items on his choice board have been assessed to determine if they are effective reinforcers for him. He chose outside, and he seems to know, based on this very short story, that he has to complete certain or engage in certain positive behaviors to get access to his token. Was it effective, though? Was the idea of working for outside and receiving the tokens, and the tokens serve as a secondary reinforcer to get him access to outside, was that effective for him? Was it effective enough to maintain and encourage the positive behaviors the teachers were seeking? When we consider the elements of reinforcement, it helps us to answer that question. There are 4 elements of reinforcement that are very important to know about when we're determining how much to give and how often to give. Density is one of those. This is how much of the reinforcement should you receive. Let's use the example of screen time. For a student to receive an opportunity to watch their favorite video clip on YouTube, that could be a reinforcer that somebody would like to work for. However, if you only let them see 10 seconds of it, would that be dense enough? There are some students who want to hear the entirety of a song or see the entirety of a clip, and only 10 seconds at a time would actually be more frustrating than reinforcing. It could be, in fact, punitive, an unpleasant stimulus that decreases the likelihood of a behavior to occur. So density is important to remember. Is it enough? Food is another example. Some kids work well for 1 M&M, but others might be extremely frustrated unless you give them the whole bag. Satiation. When we've had enough and we've had just too much of a good thing, we don't want it anymore. It may become a more powerful reinforcement again later once we have been deprived, which is the last element of reinforcement we'll talk about. But if we're satiated, if we've had an M&M every 10 seconds throughout the last hour, we might be sick and tired of M&Ms. If we've watched that same video 20 times in the past week, we just might not want to see it again. And your favorite song, when it first comes on the radio and you just love it and you want to surf through the stations to find it, eventually you get a little bit tired of hearing it over and over again every day. I'm convinced that's why they play popular songs so often on the radio, so we all get tired of them and make room for new songs. Deprivation, immediacy, I skipped one here. Immediacy means how quickly the reinforcement is presented to the student following the behavior. It's very important to provide either that token or the actual tangible reinforcement as quickly as possible after the behavior occurs. We want to make sure that reinforcement is applied to the appropriate behavior. It wouldn't have made sense to provide the token for Matthew's participation with a smartboard activity after he sat down at his desk and moved on to the next part of his schedule. It made sense to give the token as soon as he participated, followed with some verbal praise. Hey, great job, way to participate. So he knows exactly why he's getting that token. Immediacy is very important to maintain the efficacy of our reinforcement. Deprivation strengthens reinforcement, makes it more powerful. This is the opposite of satiation, as I mentioned before. For Matthew, he has been deprived of outside throughout the day. He has seems to have been wanting to choose it based on the story that we've had. He quickly picked it off that choice board, let's assume. And because it hasn't been available throughout the day, he is feeling deprived, and therefore this could be a very powerful reinforcer for him. That powerful reinforcer, in fact, could create some of the problems that we saw for Matthew during his group math session. Let's look at extinction for Matthew. What was the reinforcement for his challenging behaviors? Throwing the materials to the floor likely served as an escape function for him. Once the material leaves the desk, he doesn't have to engage in that activity. If it had stayed on the floor and nobody presented it to him again, we would assume that the next time an unpreferred task was presented, he would do it again, throw it to the floor. Hey, that works. If he's reinforced for it, then we know he's likely to do it again. So if the goal for Matthew, what he desires, is for that work to disappear, then that very minor escape behavior of pushing to the ground, or we could consider that a very minor property destruction if he actually tore the paper too, serves as an effective reinforcer for him. So the teacher, I think, was probably assuming this as well, that, hey, if I let him throw this to the floor and he doesn't have to engage in the activity, I'm only reinforcing that challenging behavior, and that's not what I want to teach my students. So her mind was in the right place as she attempted to apply extinction. And we have the question here, was it actually applied? If the reinforcer was escape from the task, and the teacher tried to remove that reinforcer by reintroducing the task, prompting him to pick it back up and complete it, then extinction was indeed attempted, but did it work? In fact, his behavior increased in intensity and led to aggression, and he still got out of the activity. We're assuming the story ends with the aggression. We don't know what happens next, whether or not he actually completes the activity. But let's assume he does not. Let's assume that the aggression then leads to Matthew leaving the classroom to have a moment to calm down, to remove him from the group activity so that he's not disturbing the other students. And then the bell rings, the 30 minutes are up. He does not receive outside, and in fact has to move on to the next lesson. If that were the final outcome of this little scenario, then his behavior was reinforced and his extinction failed. If, however, the situation changes after he hits the teacher, and he leaves the classroom and calms back down, and comes back and has to then complete the activity before having the opportunity to earn that next token, then extinction would be applied effectively. The reinforcement for the behavior was removed. However, this situation is a little complicated because the demand was in fact delayed, no matter how we look at it. So there's a risk that we are reinforcing the behavior slightly by increasing the time between the presentation of the demand and the time that Matthew engages in the behavior. And that leads us into our next topic of instructional control. In the ABA world, we often talk about discriminative stimulus, or SD. Never quite figured out why that acronym is reversed. Instead of a DS, we do call it an SD. And this is the discriminative stimulus. This is the command or demand or presentation of instruction, whatever, it's similar to an antecedent that elicits a behavior that we are hoping will elicit a behavior and that we will then reinforce to increase the rate of the behavior. So in the classroom, this is when the teacher supplies a stimulus or an instruction and is expecting a certain behavior to follow that instruction. Reinforcement would then follow the behavior. And as the cycle goes on, the student is learning and progressing through his or her goals. So when a student is non-compliant due to a challenging behavior, there's definitely a concern for loss of instructional control. There's a concern that we may be, in fact, reinforcing challenging behaviors instead of teaching the desired behavior. And I think this quite often leads us astray in determining whether or not we should encourage the instruction to be followed when a student isn't quite ready to complete that activity. For example, for Matthew, let's assume that the teacher and the assistant teacher were trying to retain instructional control by following through with that original demand. As we just discussed and we talked a little bit about extinction, it didn't work. In fact, instructional control was lost and delayed longer than it needed to be because the behavior, in fact, intensified. There's a question here at the end of the slide that says, what could be done differently to maintain that control? And when we get a little farther into the presentation, we're going to take a look at that. What could have been done differently to maintain instructional control? I wanted to highlight that question. That's why it's in bold print, because I think it's important to know that you don't have to give up instructional control just by changing your instruction. It's not an all or nothing. Reducing demands, changing faces and places, offering calming activities, offering different supports may change your instruction, but it doesn't mean you're giving up control. When a student wants to escape a demand or a situation, or when they want your attention or want access to something, especially attention and escape, they're going to get it. They will find a way to get out of the activity or to gain your attention with an increasingly difficult behavior. We, as teachers, as educators, as behaviorists, have the opportunity to decide when we're going to permit that escape from work and when we're going to provide that attention. So I often encourage teachers to think about that when they are concerned about instructional control. If you are there to present the idea of taking a break or reduce the demand, you are still the one that's in control. In this situation, Matthew quickly gained control of his environment. He was impacting the environment. He was changing the behaviors of the people around him. He definitely changed the behavior of the teacher and got the attention of the assistant teacher. So something to remember with instructional control is that it's not an all or nothing. You don't have to have it or not have it. In fact, you have to choose what level of control you have and when you're going to manipulate and supply reinforcement. You as the educator get to make those executive decisions on what you're going to reinforce, because at some point in time, you have to reinforce the behavior. De-escalation. We know that escalation is the period of time when we're transitioning from a calm state to a more heightened state of emotion and arousal. We all get escalated. We all get frustrated. We all get angry. We're human beings. It's a part of human nature. Kids do too. And children with autism are faced with so many challenges in regards to their ability to communicate and their ability to not just communicate things that they see or things that they want, but things that they don't want. The ability to protest is one that we have to teach many children on the spectrum. And imagine a day in which you are feeling a little bit out of sorts, a day that you are confused or may not understand what's happening around you, or a day that you're just feeling a little bit low and you can't communicate that, but yet you're expected to engage in all of your typical routines and behaviors. So that communication piece can definitely place a lot of challenges on children on the spectrum. Again, we all get escalated and we all have tools to de-escalate ourselves. Even feeling a little bit anxious or stressed at work, which as adults we all feel from time to time, we have coping skills. We have abilities to say, I need to take a quick break. We have ability to say, I'm going to run an errand really fast, or I'm going to take a break into the restroom, where we can take a step aside and calm down. We all have the ability to select maybe our favorite piece of candy or a piece of gum to chew, or perhaps listen to our favorite song when we drive to work to help ourselves reestablish a little bit of equilibrium. We have developed our own individualized de-escalation techniques that we use when we are in a heightened state of arousal or heightened state of emotion. For children with autism, or for children in general, but especially for children with autism who lack in the ability to identify with their own emotions and who are challenged in the areas of self-regulation and self-awareness, we need to help them learn how to de-escalate. We need to be very aware of that escalation process and the indicators that a child is escalated and help them develop the tools to de-escalate. That, I believe, is the most important part of those teachable moments when a challenging behavior is present. And again, we'll touch on that again as we get to the ending part of our presentation. Let's talk again about Matthew. Was he escalated? Let's take an excerpt from the story. He begins rocking in his seat and plugs his ears, vocalizing loudly. This behavior often precedes aggression. That last statement indicates that his rocking, plugging his ears, and loud vocalizing is actually a precursor behavior for more intensive, challenging behaviors for him. That would, to me, indicate that, yes, he is escalated. Was anything in the story done to help him de-escalate? It wasn't. Again, the teachers had a really great idea to maintain instructional control and try to apply some extinction to his behaviors so that they didn't continue to happen for him. We know that as he gets older, we don't know his age in the story, but we know that as he gets older, regardless of his current age, someday he's going to need to have a job and participate fully in his community. And if he throws work to the ground or rocks loudly or tries to get out of a demand, that's not going to serve him well. So the teachers know this, and they want to encourage him to continue with his activity and follow the demands of the class. And they tried to apply extinction, but what they didn't do was help him to de-escalate. What do we think would have changed for the instructional control and for the power of the reinforcer if de-escalation had occurred? We know that Matthew wanted to go outside, and he didn't earn a token for one of the sessions. He didn't earn a token for one part of the session. If they had helped him de-escalate when he wasn't participating, could he have earned that token? Could they have maintained the power of that reinforcer to keep him going throughout the rest of the session? If they had helped him de-escalate, could they have reintroduced the task and maintained instructional control? Could they have avoided the aggressive episode? I think they most likely could have. Let's move on and talk a little bit about integrating ABA with speech and language therapy and occupational therapy. Quite often, I think, we talk about these therapies as individual therapies. We don't often, especially with ABA, at least in my experience as a behavior analyst, talk about how well they can all get along and how beneficial they are for each other. I will say that a number of speech and language pathologists, recently I've seen a trend that speech and language pathologists will also get their certification in behavior analysis and become BCBAs. It's a very, very conducive dual field of ABA and speech therapy. And I think a lot of speech therapists recognize that the more they learn about ABA. But there's something that we can all learn from each other in collaboration. To isolate us a little bit, however, let's talk about what each of these therapies focuses on. Applied behavior analysis focuses on changing behaviors by manipulating the environment, such as the antecedents and reinforcement and so on and so forth. What ABA doesn't do is address internal events. We talked earlier about setting events, which are occasions in the environment that we may or may not be aware of when we're addressing the behavior, but that most likely impacted that behavior and triggered it to occur. However, setting events are still a part of the environment that we can see and observe and measure. And those are the parts that behavior analysts are focused on. This is what we do. We look at the environment, we look at what we can see, what we can manipulate, what we can control, and we do that. We manipulate and control it in order to change behaviors. However, there is a lot of literature in the ABA field to talk about private events. Private events are those internal states that absolutely impact behaviors, but we can't see them, and we cannot manipulate them, and we cannot control them. It doesn't mean that as behaviorists, we don't believe in them or that we don't recognize them. It simply means we have no power over them, and therefore, as applied behavior analysts, we do not address them. The counseling fields address them. Speech and language therapy actually addresses a lot of private events, talking about emotions and recognizing emotions and social interactions and so on and so forth. Occupational therapy addresses them in regards to sensory integration. However, ABA cannot, and this is one of the reasons, and I don't have counseling listed here, but the counseling field, social work and psychology, actually is another element to integrate. But ABA, speech, and occupational therapy together, combined, can be a very powerful intervention. If occupational therapy is addressing the sensory needs, how can that be useful in this scenario for Matthew? Was there anything in the environment that could have been changed? And I'm going to pause for just a moment and take a step back. And especially if there are any occupational therapists listening, I want to clarify too that that's not all occupational therapists do. I'm sure we all know that. They also are addressing all of the daily living skills and functional skills for children and students. But they are the one resource I turn to when we're looking into sensory needs. So moving on with OT. Was there anything in the environment for Matthew that could have been changed? Let's take another excerpt. During the teacher-led instruction, it's very windy outside, and another student in the classroom begins scripting loudly. Additionally, music class is occurring next door. Have you ever been in a situation like that where you need to be attending, however, the one thing you really want to do looks like it might be slipping away, and in the meantime, there's a lot of unpleasant sounds happening, and you're expected to engage in something that you may not really enjoy? Makes it awfully hard to focus, makes it awfully hard to participate. To use a personal example, this situation happens for me quite often at dinner time as I'm trying to juggle cooking for a couple of kids and large family, and everybody's loud and a baby is crying. It makes it extremely hard to not burn dinner, just as a little personal example there. So sometimes those external stimuli really change our ability to engage in our behaviors to our best ability. So could that be controlled with ABA techniques or supports? Was there additional reinforcement we could do for Matthew? Could somebody give me an additional reinforcement to really focus on dinner and not burn it when there's so much else happening in the environment? Probably not. It isn't about wanting to do the work well. It isn't about wanting to participate and feeling motivated and having reinforcement. It's about a physical ability to do it well, an ability to focus, and an ability to attend. So how could sensory supports be useful instead? What about headphones or a quiet workspace for independent work? Would those interventions likely impact his behavior? We see here how this can bring us right back to the behavioral interventions. We're not taking a step away from them. We're not turning over the reins to the OT world only when we talk about OT and sensory supports. We're looking at an integration. We, in the behavioral side, want to reduce the challenging behavior. We want to prevent it. We want to extinguish it. On the OT side, we know there are sensory integration supports that are necessary for children with autism. There are many simulations that exist. If you've never participated in one, I encourage you to help you understand what it might be like for an individual with autism in a loud, crowded place. You can actually find these on YouTube and Google sensory integration in autism or sensory simulation in autism. We know that physiologically, children with autism have sensory systems that are just a little bit, for a lack of professional term, a little bit haywired, a little bit out of whack. We know that they don't interpret sensory stimuli quite the same as neurotypical children would. Sounds are different. It's difficult for many children with autism to filter sounds and filter background sounds. They hear everything at the same volume. Not every child with autism. I am oversimplifying. The same thing for tactile and vestibular and proprioceptive inputs. Sometimes what we feel when we're sitting in a chair might be different than a child with autism. Something that might not bother me, it might bother you, or might bother them. So we don't want to downplay the importance of addressing those sensory needs. For Matthew, this was an auditory need. For other students, it could be visual, it could be tactile, it could be, again, vestibular, the need to get up and wiggle and bounce a little bit more. So what could have been done to help Matthew participate, to encourage that participation before the environment got too noisy? If we know, based on his body language, that he's feeling a little tired, he's slumped in his chair, and we might not know he's tired, but we know just by looking at him that he has slumped in his chair and continually putting his head down. If I were only using a behavioral approach and I wanted him to sit up and attend and exhibit ready-to-learn behaviors, again, I could try to manipulate the reinforcement or even manipulate the work materials to make them more engaging and motivating. Could that work? Could I use manipulations of reinforcement and the environment to encourage Matthew to sit up and participate? Maybe. But again, he's not slouched in his chair in this situation because he isn't motivated. He's slouched in his chair because he feels so tired. Think about a time when you're just exhausted or sick and you still have to be at work, how difficult it is to sit up straight and be yourself. You slouch and you want to curl into yourself and feel a little bit more comfortable. For Matthew, when he's feeling understimulated this way, when he's really feeling a little bit sluggish, he could engage in some physical activities to stimulate him. I'm sure we all, again, if you just think about yourself and your own activities that you engage in, have a list of activities that stimulate us and a list that calm us. I'm sure some of us listen to music to calm down, and others may listen to music to get a little bit more revved up. Going for a run would quite likely stimulate us and isn't something you want to do just before you go to bed. Going for a run might calm some people down when they're feeling anxious. So we need to know what Matthew needs. What would a stimulating activity be for him? And if he could engage in a stimulating activity when he's presenting with that sluggishness and slumped in his chair and putting down his head, if somebody could take a moment to help him engage in a stimulating activity, how would that impact his behavior? How would it have changed the events that occurred in our story? Oftentimes, occupational therapists, if they're trained to do so, can administer a sensory profile assessment and determine for that particular child what activities are arousing and what activities are calming. And I hope I'm using the right terminology there. I believe it's calming and arousing. But we get the gist of it. It's important to know your students well. Again, just like for reinforcement, for sensory activities and for sensory challenges, those occupational therapy assessments are very useful, and input is very useful. But going back to the ABA side of it, how would his challenging behaviors be prevented if he could have had the stimulating activity? He may have, in fact, if he had a 2-minute sensory break to improve his alertness and ability to participate, he may have earned that second token, which I think could have made a huge difference in the outcome for his story. Speech and language therapy. We're all very familiar with how important speech therapy is for students with autism, as communication is one of the primary deficits of this disorder. Speech therapy often begins with teaching children a communication system when they're nonverbal, improving their vocabulary, even for children who are verbal. Sometimes those communication systems help to use their verbal abilities more effectively, and especially socially. We know that speech therapy can be used for articulation to make speech occur more clearly, to shape those perseverative speech and echolalias and such into more functional speech. However, speech therapy can also be used to help children learn to express their feelings, both physical and emotional. Was Matthew able to communicate his physical feelings? Was he able to say, "I'm really tired"? Was he able to communicate his emotions, to say, "I don't want to do this," or "I'm worried"? I am making an assumption, and as a behavior analyst, this is completely against my grain here to do so, but based on the story we have for Matthew, knowing that outside is a powerful reinforcer for him, and it hasn't been available today because of rain, knowing that he's only received one token, and now the wind has kicked back up outside, and he's looking out the window and sees that just before some of his precursor behaviors begin, I have to wonder, could he be worried that it's going to rain again and he might not get his reinforcer? Does he have a way to express that? I can think of most children who could communicate that, certainly would be looking out the window and say, "Oh no, it's going to rain." And they might complain. And we would say back to them, "Oh, you're right. Would you like to choose something else?" Or, "You know what? We're going to be outside so soon, I bet we'll beat the rain." We'd be able to talk them through those feelings a little bit. Unfortunately for Matthew, nobody's able to do so because he can't express those concerns. To address this behavior long term, would a communication-based replacement behavior be effective? Something like functional communication training. Functional communication training is a wonderful ABA technique where speech therapy and ABA really do marry well. It's a fairly recent ABA intervention. I think early 2000s, maybe 2002 or 2006, you began to see this in the literature, where we are using communication skills to replace challenging behaviors. And some of the recent literature I've read, in fact, it was very recent, and I don't have it to quote for this or include in any references, unfortunately, but I will say I recently read an article discussing how functional communication training, in fact, decreases additional challenging behaviors than the one that it's targeted. So, for example, if we were using FCT to address Matthew's aggression, we might also see his attentive behaviors improve and his noncompliant behaviors decrease, with the results of the study that I had a chance to read just the other day. Applied Behavior Analysis, FBAs, and BIPs, two of our favorite acronyms in this field. For those of you working with children with autism in a school setting, I'm sure you're familiar with them both, but just to outline them a little bit in more detail, a functional behavior assessment is an FBA, and this is where we assess the cause and or the maintaining variables of the behavior to determine the function. We use some direct and indirect assessments, such as observations, analysis of those ABC data that we talked about earlier, the antecedents and consequences. We actually take the antecedents and the consequences and analyze them to the point of determining those correlational coefficients to decide which antecedents are most likely to proceed the behavior and which consequences are most likely to follow, which helps us know how to manipulate the environment a little bit more to address the behavior. We use screening tools to help determine what a potential hypothesis of a function might be, so that when we do our systematic observations and data analysis, we have a little bit narrowed down field of what to be looking for. Interviews of staff and parents are critical. I worry sometimes that this is the part that we overlook. Interviewing parents and interviewing staff that are with the child all day is the only way to determine those setting events outside of following that student for an entire couple of days and recording everything that happens. If I ever have the opportunity to do that, I do, and it's a wonderful outcome. I've often had interns, actually, it's a wonderful role for somebody learning to become a behavior analyst, to follow a student for an entire 2 or 3 day period and record what's happening every 2 minutes for those entire couple of days. And we're able to see patterns of setting events and antecedents that we couldn't otherwise see. But due to time constraints and how unlikely it is that we can do that sort of intensive data collection for every child we are working with, those interviews are extremely beneficial to help us determine setting events and private events as well for the child. A BIP then is the acronym for Behavior Intervention Plan. And this is kind of the outcome of the functional behavior assessment. This is where we identify proactive strategies to prevent the behaviors based on that antecedent analysis, reactive strategies to help de-escalate and avoid reinforcing the behavior should it occur, and additionally, extinction if we think we can do it effectively. And we would determine some replacement behaviors. When we're looking at replacement behaviors, what we don't want to do is we don't want to say, what do we want the child to do? Instead, we need to ask, what can he or she do that would achieve the same function? So quite often when I ask a teacher, well, okay, so the behavior is task avoidance. What would you like them to do instead? The teacher would probably say, do the task. So that makes sense. We want them to engage in the work, and that's a great long-term goal. But immediately, task avoidance might look like loud screaming and throwing the papers to the floor. We want to teach the child a replacement behavior that would achieve the same function. So if that child is trying to escape work, we need to teach a replacement behavior to escape work that is better than screaming and throwing the paper. Later on, we can look at increasing motivation to complete work, look at environmental concerns of why isn't he or she engaging in the work? Does it make sense? Is the environment conducive to learning? Is the reinforcement effective? Is the work fun? What is it about this activity that makes the child not want to participate? That, of course, is appropriate and necessary to do. But when we write a behavior plan, we need to focus on a behavior that will achieve the same function as the maladaptive behavior. And it's always great if that replacement behavior actually gets more reinforcement than the maladaptive behavior. We want to be competitive. We want to show the child there's something else you can do, and it's even better. There's a better way to meet your wants and needs. That's the only effective way to truly replace that behavior. We cannot simply say, you need to extinguish your behavior and do something different. As we've talked a few times, extinction is extremely effective, but very difficult to do effectively. How about the FBA and the behavior plan for Matthew? Based on this very brief sample given, what hypothesis would you test regarding the function of the behavior? I think it's a very simple example of an escape behavior. It's like the escape maintained. It was very clear that when the task was presented, he threw it to the floor. We don't see any indication that he was looking around to see who watched, suggesting that he'd be looking for attention. We don't see that he's asking repetitively to go outside and that he might just be trying to get access to outside sooner. In fact, the only indication we have about a function for this behavior is simply that he didn't engage in the demand. So that is suggesting escape. What setting events and environmental conditions should be considered, however? We know that he's trying to escape the work, but do we know anything about the setting events based on the story? We know that he is tired. We know that he's a little understimulated, whether that's because mom wrote a note in that day to tell us he got up early or simply because we're paying attention to his nonverbal cues. What other environmental conditions should we be considering? What about the noise in the classroom? If we're attentive to Matthew's needs, we would recognize that his precursive behaviors began close to the time that music got a little loud next door and the peers started vocalizing and the wind kicked up. So we might need to consider those environmental conditions as we are conducting our behavior analysis. If we do, it's going to lead us to some proactive strategies that can be very effective for preventing the target behavior of aggression for Matthew. Some proactive strategies that we could put into place would include actually a lot of strategies from OT. We would want to look at some sensory supports to increase attention and participation. Now, if I were the behavior analyst writing this behavior plan, that's what I would put in my plan, and then I would consult with the occupational therapist to determine what those supports are. This is where that integration is just so important. I'm not trained as a behavior analyst to really know what the best sensory supports are for Matthew. I don't know how, and I'm not qualified to conduct a sensory profile assessment. I haven't studied the different types of physical and physiological activities that stimulate different parts of the brain, stimulate arousal and calming activities, but an OT has. And I think that it would improve the quality of my behavior plan to integrate that field into what I'm doing to address the needs of the student. A quiet working environment is a little simpler. Yes, we would like Matthew to be able to participate in a group lesson in that group environment. But if he physically and sensory-wise can't do that, maybe we're asking too much. There are many things I wish I could do physically that I just may not ever be built to do. I'm never going to slam dunk a basketball. You can't see me now, but I'm only 5'1". That's just not something I'm going to be capable of doing. For Matthew, if he has autism and he has a difficult time focusing in a loud environment, then we need to teach him how to adapt to his own disability, how to ask, or how to either provide him at this point with a quiet working environment or later on with replacement behaviors, teach him how to ask for that environment. Maybe we could provide him with some headphones to help him stay in the environment and still be able to participate. Moving on to replacement behaviors, as I mentioned, he could ask for a break. If he's feeling a little bit too overstimulated by the environment currently, instead of throwing the work to the floor, maybe he could ask to have a break or, like I mentioned just a moment ago, to have a different environment to do the activity in. We found it very effective to teach students to ask for a different room, to have a pull-out room, and teach students how to ask to go to that room when they need to do their work there instead. Sometimes students need to go in that room and have a couple of minutes with a calming activity and then engage in their work. It would also be great to teach him how to communicate his physical feelings or his emotions, how to ask, can I still go outside? Or it looks like it might rain. Does he have the ability to comment? Does he have the ability to say, I'm tired, I want to lay down? Does he have the ability to protest? I don't want to do this. Reactive strategies. How can we change the reactive strategies if we're writing a behavior plan for Matthew? Remember, our goal is to reduce aggression or to extinguish aggression. So we know some of the triggers for that aggression for Matthew included the removal of a token. We call that a response cost procedure. If a student earns a reinforcement or earns a token towards reinforcement, and we then remove that for maladaptive behavior, that's called a response cost. There's a cost for Matthew's response of pushing his work to the floor and refusing to pick it back up. That's not necessarily productive. A response cost procedure is, in fact, a punitive procedure. So the idea for punishment, I think I mentioned earlier, punishment is the opposite of reinforcement in such that it decreases the likelihood of a behavior happening again. There are times when response cost is very appropriate. I find it more appropriate for higher functioning students, for older students. who are really ready for that level of there are consequences. If you engage in this behavior, you're going to lose some privileges or access to privileges. And that's an appropriate developmental consequence, I believe, for, again, higher functioning or older students. Is it appropriate for Matthew? Maybe. Is it effective? Just like reinforcement, punishment is only effective if it decreases the likelihood of a behavior to happen again. Did the removal of a token decrease Matthew's behaviors? Or did it, in fact, increase his escalation? I would recommend the latter. We could avoid physical prompting when he's escalated. We know from this example that the physical prompt, in fact, triggered Matthew to move to a more intensive behavior. He was avoiding engaging in precursors, and that physical prompt was what led to it was the removal of the token that finally led to the hit, but the physical prompt certainly didn't help his escalation period. We could also reactively allow some calming activities when precursor behaviors are present. If we want to avoid aggression, and we know that rocking, plugging ears, and vocalizing is a precursor, then we should apply our intervention there. We should intervene when precursors are present to prevent the aggression from occurring and de-escalate at that point in time. So I'm going to talk a little bit in a summary here and make sure we have plenty of time for questions and answers. What we've discussed today is how applied behavior analysis provides us with many useful tools to address behaviors. We know that from ABA, we have some excellent tools to assess behaviors and determine their function and determine why they're happening. We have the powerful tools of reinforcement and punishment and extinction to manipulate consequences, to increase behaviors or decrease behaviors. We've learned a little bit about some elements of reinforcement, which, on a side note, also apply to punishment, which is a word we never like to say, but it's not necessarily aversive. Again, it's a consequence that's reducing the likelihood of a behavior to happen. So anyways, we talked a little bit about some elements of reinforcement, such as density and satiation and deprivation and immediacy, that can really change the power of those tools. We've talked about looking into antecedents and setting events, but we need to remember there are limits to these manipulations, these environmental manipulations of reinforcement and extinction. We need to remember that there are some more complicated ABA phenomena that we always have to take into consideration when we're addressing behaviors. It's wonderful to receive training in ABA. It's wonderful to have that knowledge of reinforcement. It's wonderful to have the ability to use those techniques. But I think just as I am not an occupational therapist, if you don't have extensive training in the ABA, it's at least important to remember there are some more complicated elements to consider. And I encourage anybody writing behavior plans or addressing challenging behaviors in the classroom to learn more about those setting events and private events and to continue increasing the circle of what we address in regards to behaviors. We've discussed how when we use an interdisciplinary approach, we can actually address the needs of the whole child. So there are limits to ABA, as there are limits to any field that is addressing the needs of a child. Children with autism don't simply have a behavior disorder. The qualifiers for autism include the communication. We know from research the challenges with sensory integration. We know that there are many other needs for a child with autism aside from behaviors. So using an interdisciplinary approach can, in fact, increase the success of your behavior intervention plans, increase the likelihood that you truly will make a difference in reducing those challenging and maladaptive behaviors for your student, and do so long-term by teaching appropriate replacement behaviors and addressing the communication and physiological needs of the child. And collaborating with your SLPs and OTs really allows an opportunity to select more effective interventions as a whole, and helps them in the turn as well to increase their effectiveness as therapists and interventionists. And lastly, I want to remind everybody that ABA, speech therapy, occupational therapy, and again, we can toss in here counseling, they are not mutually exclusive. I think for many years we've worked together to address the needs of a student or child, However, we don't often work cohesively. Speech therapy happens during the speech therapy time, and OT happens during OT time, and ABA happens during instruction, and behavior plans go with the child throughout the day. But working closely together, they can be cohesive interventions. They do not have to be mutually exclusive and happen only in one space or another. I also sometimes hear people say, we do ABA, we don't do OT, or we're speech therapists, we don't do ABA. And again, you don't have to pick. You don't have to just do one. You can do what you're best at, what you're trained to do, and work well together with the other interventionists that really can impact the needs of the whole child for a child with autism. At this point in time, I would love to receive questions and move into discussion mode. So please let me know what questions I can answer or any topics from our presentation that you would like a little bit more detail about. You can type your questions to me now. I often, when I'm doing these presentations face-to-face, I love interaction. And many of these questions I would have paused along the way to ask you about our student Matthew, or have some of this time at the end. We have about 20 minutes left that we can use another case sample if anybody has one they'd like to present, and we can apply some of the topics we've discussed to case samples you may have. So please don't be shy and let me know what questions I can answer for you. I will give it just a minute, as I know sometimes it takes some time to actually type your questions out. Wow, it actually looks like we do not have any questions today. So I will turn the microphone back over to Lauren.
Participating today. And I did want to let you know that in the next couple of days, we will be posting a copy of Stacy's presentation along with an archived recording of the webinar to our website. I will send an email out to everybody with links to those materials as soon as they're available. Before we go, we do have a question that's just come in.
And I'll read the question in case you all can't see it. I don't think you can. The question is, do you think that addressing a child's private or sensory needs are actually a primary foundational need? I'm hoping I'm understanding this question right here. I believe what you're asking is whether or not I believe the private or sensory needs are critical to address in reducing behaviors. And yes, I think they are, absolutely. The private events, again, we can't address them as behavior analysts, but we need to consider them. We need to consider that feelings and emotions impact our behaviors, that thoughts impact our behaviors. We need to take that into consideration in order to teach replacement behaviors appropriately. So as an example, I've worked with a student before who engages in self-injury, not because of any consistent antecedents in the environment, but because of private events, because of remembering situations that were unpleasant for him and would engage in severe self-injury. We can't change his thoughts. We couldn't reduce his self-injury by trying to manipulate those private events, but what we could do is try to teach a replacement behavior for when the thoughts occurred. So we looked for precursors that indicated self-injury was coming soon and helped to give the child something different to do in replace of the self-injury when needed, because we couldn't change those private events. Again, for sensory needs, yes, there are other students who may engage in aggression when there are loud sounds present, and we would definitely want to address that need to prevent the behavior. The example I'm receiving here is, for example, needing to eat to function. A sensory diet is necessary for any other function. I'm hoping you could explain that just a little bit more. Is needing to eat a function, sensory diet is necessary for any other function? Needing to eat could be a function of a behavior, I think is what you're commenting on, and is a sensory diet necessary for any other function? A sensory diet Oh, I'm sorry, for any person, she's clarified. So is a sensory diet necessary for any person? A sensory diet is not necessary for any person. I don't think I know I'm not on a sensory diet, but I certainly know there are children who, when they can engage in the appropriately stimulating activities or calming activities, can impact their behaviors. This individual and participant is clarifying her question again to say that needing to eat is a function for any person. You're right, it is. And is a sensory diet necessary for any person? Again, probably not a sensory diet, but for a child who has a difficult time understanding his or her own needs physiologically, it's helpful to address those needs systematically through an assessment that can indicate what would be stimulating or calming for him or her. Thank you for that question. I look forward to others if there are more. Thank you for your time.